Escaping the Fold by Vincent Merkel. The Fire on the Ridge. There was a definite signal that the owner of that voice behind the rocks was trying to send to me. Sure that my suspicions were correct, I spoke to her. "I want to thank you. You saved me. Thank you. I do not want to bother you. It is just that I am lost." After waiting a minute for an answer and receiving none, I turned my back to the dogs and their elusive master, picked up my bow, and began walking up the hill towards the ridge and my food stash. I looked over my shoulder to make sure the beasts were not following me and that I had not misjudged their intentions. They had silently vanished into the jungle. I fortified my encampment and went to await dusk at my fire pit. Some rascally creature had knocked over my carefully arranged stack of tinder and logs, which only required small effort to rebuild. I watched the cobalt blues of the ocean and cerulean hues of the sky deepen as dusk gave way to the half-lit ruler of the night. I thought for a moment I could actually see the man on the moon wink at me. I lit the signal fire, blowing and fanning the growing embers until a burst of flame engulfed the twigs and branches on the bottom of the stack. Hastily, I threw dry pine sticks into the mix, and soon that very spot on the ledge high above the ocean was blazing fantastically. I put my back to the extreme fire and looked for the silhouette of the far-away island. It was at the edge between stars and sheer darkness, where a glimmer below the star line caught my eye. I stared for 5 minutes and saw it again. It was the speck of a flicker no bigger than a grain of sand. My heart leapt within my breast, for I knew what I was seeing. This was no lone red star separated from the firmament. I needed to be sure and was hesitant to blink. I looked away and returned my gaze with hopes that my eyes were not deceiving me. I watched again and almost lost that red pinhole in the black ink of the horizon. The color intensified. The light became bigger, and I threw more sticks onto my fire. I looked again, and the dim light became a miniature candle many miles away. I stood lost in the hope that my friends were signaling me when a splash of liquid, followed by another, doused the blaze behind me and rendered the atmosphere a thick screen of steam. The hissing of coals, drowning to their one weakness, water, sizzled in the wet ash of the fire pit. As I jumped to the other side of the smoldering fire, I watched her run away towards my camp. I hesitated. Spear in hand, I returned my eyes to the far-away torch. I watched it burn bright for a moment on the distant island and go out in an instant. Much closer in, below the cliffs on the northern shore, out in the moonlit foamy crests on the salty brine, there gleamed 2 blue evil jewels, the twin sparkling beacons of hate. A twig snapped. I could hear her running into the mouth of the jungle near my little camp. I ran after her. I knew enough of the path to navigate through the trees and stones with a fair speed. I anticipated a fallen tree trunk on the trail and jumped over it. I would like to think that I ran with all of the grace of a gazelle in that chase, but she was clearly nimbler than me. My foot cleared the log with ease, but upon stretching my right leg for the next leap, a snare grabbed my ankle with some force, and I was swept off of my feet and, to my dismay, hanging upside down by one leg. It happened so fast that I didn't have time to drop my spear which I stabbed into the earth below my head for the purpose of stabilizing my swinging body. I knew there was going to be trouble, but I could never have guessed how much. The moon's light broke through the canopy of the jungle's upper terraces and lit the ground in front of me. A girl walked out from behind a tree and stepped into that light. Her spear was pointed down towards my head. I looked up to the rope that was neatly coiled around the moccasin that protected my ensnared ankle. It was the same blessed fiber that enabled my climb to the ridge. She walked closer. She was in the same trappings as when she visited me during my slumber. Her physique was enough to deter me from thinking to lift my spear to fight. She was fleet and strong and clean. She was sturdy and ready for a contest. The situation seemed so illogical to me. I was about to ask her what her problem was when she neatly whipped her glimmering spear and efficiently yanked my lance from the ground and my hand, throwing it out of reach. She looked down at my face, which I am sure was a rosy color by that time from the sheer embarrassment of being so easily trapped. The woman threw her arms out like a little child and began to scold me in a strange and enchanting gibberish. She shook her finger at me and walked around the slowly twirling rope to keep my eyes engaged with hers. I thought she was telling me some kind of a joke when she threw her hands to her tilted hips and waited for a reply. I looked beyond her as the lasso swung me around, and I saw the yellow reflections of the moon in the eyes of her beasts, the thylacines, standing 10 feet away from her. They eagerly watched, but made no advances as I pantomimed while speaking in clear and deliberate English. "Why did you extinguish my fire?" She leaned down and grabbed my face in her sturdy grip and jerked my head to her direction. She used her thumb to pull my eyelids back and closely inspected my eyes. The bronze and wonderful woman looked like a child while she pantomimed the same hand signals that I had tried to convey to her, all the while gibbering away in her unknown language. She added to my act, of course, waving her arms sinuously. She contorted her face into a sneer and hissed at me. She used her hands as if they were snakes and enacted out a striking motion direct at my eyes. Her fingers were fangs. She never landed a blow, though she could have easily hurt me, and I followed her every move. Her hands played out a scene where she held them like claws that framed her steely eyes. She began to chant in a monotonous tone, and sneered and hissed again. She crossed her arms and briefly waited for a reply before commencing with her show. Pointing with one hand down the hill to the southeast was a signal, accompanied by further scolding. She made strange faces and acted out an outlandish dance, stopped and looked at me. "I have friends over there," I yelled at her and jerked my hand in the direction of the fire she doused. Her pet marsupials started to whine and move towards me as if they were challenged by my voice. The woman turned to the thylacines and commanded. They sat down on their haunches. I partially drew my machete from the belt of leather that held it snugly in place, and was immediately countered by a swift blow from the handle of her spear. She kept my hand far from the cutting edge. I looked to her and pointed to the rope that suspended my full weight above the ground. Her hand went for my scalp, where her finger traced my hair, stitched over the fading wound on my head. She reached for the handle of my makeshift blade and drew it from its holster. The wild woman stood and looked me in the eye as she raised the machete high above her head. Her arm moved like a whip, guiding the razor-sharp steel to the rope, and I fell to the ground in a most undignified way. The girl turned to leave and called out another order to her massive guardian animals as she dropped my blade. "Ella" was the word that came from her mouth. The quadrupeds arose and followed her. My memory flashed earlier in the day when a whispering sound came from behind a rock, and those same beasts sat squarely in front of her hiding place. Now I recognized the word she had used. She said katse. It was the Greek word for sit. This time the word she uttered was Ella, the Hellenistic word for come. I knew that I could communicate with this person. She spoke my mother's tongue. As she walked away, I vocalized with the language of the woman who raised me and asked my captor to wait a minute. The sleek-limbed girl kept walking. I asked again, "Please, wait." She reached her arm behind one of the gray stone pillars coming out of the earth and hefted something of considerable weight from the other side of the rocks and threw it onto the trail behind her. It was my deerskin backpack, roll of skins and bedding. She picked up a long stick and rested it over her shoulders. On each end was a considerable leather bladder, presumably full of water. She looked over her shoulder to me and answered my request to wait with one word: "Come." As she turned towards me, she walked briskly, barking commands to her beasts. They scattered into the forest in every direction except for that of her current path. The wild woman was leading me back up towards the fire pit that she had just extinguished. She glared angrily at me as the stick on her shoulders that carried the burdensome weight of the heavily swinging water bladders struck me across the chest. A chirp like that of a night bird broke from her lips, and I heard the answering high-pitched yips of her terrible jungle friends. I once tried to speak to her, but she only stopped, looked me in the eye with an ever-agitated stare, and made a harsh and abrupt shushing noise. I strapped my rucksack onto my back and picked up my spear, only, of course, after she had kicked it back onto the path. I spoke in a hushed tone to try to find out what she was up to. She answered with one word again: "No, shh." She jerked her thumb towards the southeast side of the island. At the top of the path, it was obvious that the 10 or so gallons of water she had used to douse my signal fire were effective in their purpose, as not a single coal burned. After kicking all of my half-burnt wood over the edge of the cliff, she picked up a hardy pine branch from the trail, handed it to me, and began to pantomime a sweeping motion. The woman grabbed a similar branch for herself and started pushing the black coals over the precipice. Once I joined in with my rude broom, she poured water over the stone landing that was my hearth. In less than 5 minutes, there was no evidence of fire. The cliff was scrubbed clean. I looked out to where I'd seen that hopeful speck of red light in the distance. I now know that she only meant to help me, but then I hadn't understood that I might have given her location away. I did not know that it was not Lernea that she was worried about at the time. There was a depraved tribe of beastly people on the island that sought every opportunity to cause the girl mischief and grief. I looked down to the sea on the beach of my misfortune, and was satisfied that no wicked eyes sought me, Yet the water lit up with faint electrical charges far out in the depths of the evil creature's domain. I looked again to the spot that daylight would reveal as a distant island. It was the sanctuary of my two friends and their hosts. My mates. My friends Vangelis and George hoped and suspected that I was alive and well. They were shipwrecked on that remote, deserted island on the horizon, and had already found refuge. Upon the hull of the Tilly breaking in two, they had been thrown into the roiling waters close to each other. In the waves they shouted to one another, and one of the two small dinghies that were tied to the sides of the mothership bobbed on a nearby crest a mere 15 feet from where they swam for their lives. George, being the stronger of the two, put forth a heroic effort and swam up the advancing wave, gulping mouthfuls of brine in his panicked struggle. Finally, after minutes that dragged on like hours, his hand found a rope that was tied around the inflatable raft, and he heaved his body into the little gray and orange boat. George called out for Vangelis, but the torrent of water and rain drowned out everything that wasn't a watery echo. He went aft and began pulling frantically on the starter cord of the little boat's 25-horsepower engine. Just as the little motor started to cough and the propeller gurgled the churning froth, George heard a noise. The voice of Vangelis. He looked down at the side of the dinghy, and 10 feet out was the chubby chemist and chef, being swept down the falling swell and out of view. George revved the throttle and gave chase to his friend who had just vanished in the wave. The fearful seaman scanned the water and saw him. Reaching in, George fished an exhausted and grateful Vangelis out of the soupy mix of planks and rubbish and pitched his comrade into the little life raft. Vangelis yelled out, "Where is Thomas?" George revved the little motor, turned the rudder starboard, and started searching the stormy ocean. He widened his arc, scanning for signs of life, and he spotted something orange moving in the distance. It was another dinghy, and on it were two men. Vangelis shouted, "Thomas, thank God you are alive!" A shout came back to the two ship hands, and as their boats closed distance, it was a disheartening sight to see Captain Christos and his first mate, Nikos, on that little raft. The hardened Nikos lifted a revolver to his eye level and fired a shot at the mutineers. Christos was cursing at the motor on his little dinghy. It refused to start. George yanked the rudder hard to port, and they vanished into the rain. Vangelis had taken a bullet in his thigh. Had the boats not been wildly bobbing up and down, he would have been a dead man, as Nikos was an accomplished marksman. Fortunately for the wounded one, the bullet passed right through his meaty thigh, having missed bone and vital arteries. George tied his shirt tightly around his mate's leg, and the bleeding quickly stopped. They drifted for a long while, and when the storm let up, Vangelis and George took turns sleeping and watching for land. The emergency radios on the boat did not yield any results. When day broke, they had run the gas dry, and the motor was of no more use than that of an anchor. The fog was thick and impenetrable as the two seamen were contemplating their deaths. "If I die," said Vangelis, "you can eat me to stay alive. Just remember, the best meat is in the rump." He laughed aloud. George shook his head and replied, The sharks wouldn't eat you, fool." He paused as a slight breeze blew a thin cloud of mist off of a sandy beach less than 50 feet away. "Tell me, Vagilaki," George asked, "do you see what I see?" Vangelis answered, "Yes, friend, 2 dead men." George leaned over the edge of the little skiff and pointed to the shore. "No, Vangeli, over there." As I think about the stars over the inky and dark silhouette of the other island, and the red flame that I observed there on the night that I met the most wonderful woman to ever trap me in a snare, I will always remember the hope that I felt to think that my friends lived. Now I know that my mates survived, but then I was looking out over the cliff when the butt end of my spear poked me on my side. I turned my body to the right and raised my arm above the weapon. The warrior woman stood ready and wide-eyed, glancing back to the path where we had first met. There was a cold chill in the air. The girl had wrapped my lion skin on the end of my spear. She poked me with it again, and I took the bundle in my hand. She abruptly turned her back to me and began briskly walking away. I put on my coat and disappeared under the lion's glorious camouflage. She stopped and waited, smiling over her shoulder. I secured my pack, machete, and bow. I gripped my steel-tipped spear, braced myself, and then nodded.